September 17th. I'm sorry it's so warm in here. I have the door open, and my mom's telling me that it's bothering her eyes, so we might have to close it.
I have old eyes.
Yeah, yeah.
Glare's bothering me. I can't see everyone's beautiful faces.
Yeah. Anyway, welcome back. Welcome back. I'm so happy to be here. I was so bummed to have missed last month. I know Dr. Wakely came down and spoke to us all, and I was able to sign in once I landed at the airport and was waiting for my luggage for the last few minutes of it. The internet was down on the plane, so I couldn't sign in there. But it looked like a great meeting. I've heard a ton of great feedback that it was a great meeting, so I'm sorry to have missed it. There are more people coming in as we're moving through. Hello to everybody out there watching. Thank you so much for signing in. Tonight we have Dr. Jack West from Swedish up in Seattle. So I know I've sent you guys all emails letting you know that he's coming. I know that most of you, if not all of you, already know who he is and all of the wonderful work he's doing in lung cancer. So what I'm going to do tonight, because I'm trying to get Jack back to Seattle tonight at a reasonable hour, because he has clinic tomorrow, and we all know how important it is that our doctors are well rested for clinic. I'm going to go around the room, and I'm going to ask everybody to just tell us your name, your stage, and diagnosis, what type of lung cancer you have, and then just let me know if you want to come back around to something that you want to talk about. Of course, as Dr. West goes through his presentation, we'll be able to ask questions and do that kind of thing. But if there's something specific, since we're not doing the big around the room tonight, just kind of let me know, and I'll flag you guys in my notebook. And I know you're going to kill me. I always start with you.
I know. Do you have a little announcement to make first?
Well, I was going to make it at the end. It's a surprise.
Oh, well, but some people might be gone at the end.
And some people might not be here now.
Twice.
We should make it twice.
Yeah.
So the announcement I would like to make is that this Thursday at 2 o'clock, yours truly, along with our very own Emily Bennett, are on the Steve Harvey Show. So it's airing this Thursday at 2 o'clock. We've been keeping it a big secret. We went out to Chicago and filmed a month or so ago. And we're really, really excited about it. The show is going to start off with teenage sexting, so it's
we're
a little
not on
different.
That section.
A little different than lung cancer.
We're not on that section.
But our stories, I shouldn't say it's more important. I have teenagers, so I don't know. Anyway, so Steve Harvey Show on NBC this Thursday. If you're here in the Bay Area, which all of you in the room are, it's 2 o'clock. Otherwise, check your local TV stations, because I'm not sure if the time's different in other time zones. Yes, Ellie?
I looked last night.
I can't hear you.
When I looked last night on Comcast's thing, it said the America's Cup was on
so
there.
this is what's going to be a little bit tricky. We're really, really, really rooting for Australia to take it tomorrow. Because if they do, we won't have to worry about the America's Cup on Thursday. If they do not, we're going to have to figure out I don't know if it'll be a re-air.
More to follow. It'll be on at
we'll
some
figure
point
out that
in time.
thing.
But,
that is unfortunately our time slot.
Especially here. It'll be on in other areas, though.
Oh, yeah.
Tomorrow.
The Bay Area is being, inundated.
We'll just miss it because
So everybody root for Australia. Everybody.
But as soon
or New
as
Zealand,
airs,
same 6 and 1/2 dozen, right? They're right next to each other.
as soon as it airs, there'll be a link on our website to watch it that way.
Yeah.
So we'll get it.
Yeah.
But it's a great national program to get the word out on lung cancer. And Emily Bennett is a 27-year-old stage 4 lung cancer patient and never smoker. So, we have a lot to say about the fact that anyone can get lung cancer. And hopefully that's going to break some barriers on the stigma and all of these things that hold back our research money, right? And moving forward to really curing a lot more people for this disease. So we're really excited that this won't be the first time and it won't be the last. So all good, yay.
So let's do around the room, and then I'll introduce Dr. West, and we'll get started on tonight's program. So thanks, Tina.
Yes, keep this short and sweet. My name is Tina, and I was diagnosed with stage 3B non-small cell adenocarcinoma. You can't hear me?
I don't think your mic's on, Tina.
Elaine's yelling at me.
Is that better? Okay. Tina, non-small cell adenocarcinoma, 3B. And I've been on Tarceva for over 2 years now. Everything's good so far.
And just got back from Italy, yay.
Got back.
And who's the guy to your right?
Who's that guy?
This is Rick, and I can't believe you brought somebody from Seattle down here after they just beat the heck out of the 49ers.
I know. Go figure.
Hi, I'm Mary Basso, and I was diagnosed in 2010, October 2010, with non-small cell lung cancer and adenocarcinoma. And I'm currently on Tarceva because I have the EGFR gene mutation.
My name's Elizabeth Lacasia. I'm stage 4 non-small cell adenocarcinoma, bronchoalveolar with papillary mixed whatevers. I am on a clinical trial, have been on this particular clinical trial for 3 years. It's a combination of Alimta and Tarceva, and I am stable and doing well.
Thank you.
My name's Elaine Gray. I've missed the last 2 Tuesdays. I was in the hospital. Hate that place, but they're nice. Anyway, I was diagnosed in May of 2008. Been taking chemo ever since. Will probably always have to, and I missed you all. I love you all, and I missed you. So glad I'm here tonight.
We missed you too.
Hi, I'm Sally, and I was found at stage 1A. Luckily, I had my lower right lobe removed, and I have not needed treatment, luckily, and it's non-small cell adenocarcinoma.
But it's important to note that Sally was on the ILCAP screening program and found her cancer very early because of that.
Hi, David Beach. It's the first time here. I was diagnosed in January 2009, stage 1B. Then I had a recurrence in 2011, non-small cell adenocarcinoma. And I guess so I had stage 4 because of that. I've been on Alimta and Avastin since then, and then I just had a test. They retested my tissue, and they found the EGFR mutation. So I'm now figuring out whether I'm going to do Tarceva or not. But I also just on Thursday and Friday had a clear CT, NED, clear MRI, brain MRI, nothing. I'm cleared. So.
That's fantastic.
I'm Jeff. I'm Carrie's uncle, and I'm her chauffeur.
Hi, I'm Carrie. I was diagnosed in October 2011 with non-small cell adenocarcinoma and been on chemotherapy of some kind for the last 2 years. I was showing stable in my lung CT, although my recent MRI has shown brain metastases. So I'm now in the middle of 2 weeks of whole brain radiation, and we'll see what the doctors recommend after that.
I'm Eric, and I was diagnosed with stage 3A adenocarcinoma in March, and been through chemo, radiation, and surgery, lobectomy so far. And we've just done some post-surgery CT and PET scans to see where we're at, and actually have no idea. So we're waiting some more to find out if that will change, and hopefully for the better.
Hi, my name is Aloy, and I'm Eric's fiance, and I'm waiting with him for good news.
Esty, you have your...
I'm Esty, and I was diagnosed in 2003, and I had my top lobe removed and center, and I have... I had stage 1 bronchoalveolar, and I'm being monitored because I have a lot of spots since then, ground glass and whatever. But once a year, I'm being monitored. So far, it's fine. Thank you.
I'm Kathy Curry, and I was diagnosed as stage 3 last April of 2012 and quickly moved to stage 4, non-small cell adenocarcinoma, BAC. And actually been on Tarceva last year and currently progressing, so I'm looking for a clinical trial to go on now.
I'm Bob Curry. I'm along for the ride.
Do you guys want to start, Christy? Is there a mic back there?
I'm Christy Chappelle, and I have stage 4 adenocarcinoma, non-small cell cancer, lung cancer, and I was diagnosed in December of 2009, and I have been on some form of chemo, except for a little bit of time on Tarceva for most of this time, and things were going really well, and I'm feeling great. But an MRI turned up a little bit of brain activity. And so I had a CyberKnife procedure a couple weeks ago, and that went very, very well. And I'm hoping that an MRI in 3 months will show that all's clear. But if how I feel is any indication of what's going on, it's good news. But I have to wait and see, so I'm in a waiting pattern now. So, thank you.
I'm Penelope. I'm here in support of my mom. She was diagnosed February 2012, stage 4 non-small cell adenocarcinoma. Her recent scan showed some progression, so she's back on some new chemo. But she says she feels good. She just celebrated 44 years of marriage, and we celebrated my grandma's 100th birthday. So we're all doing okay.
Babies.
Yes, and our 2 new babies.
Penelope, this is the only time she gets out, so this is her social life.
This is my night off.
Right, this is her social life.
Hi, I'm Linda, and I was diagnosed with stage 4 adenocarcinoma August of 2011, and I have the EGFR mutation, 19 deletion. I've been on Tarceva for 2 years, and as of yesterday, I have progressed, so I'm looking into a clinical trial or a fatinib or whatever. So we'll see what happens.
I'm Linda's husband. I'm here to support her 110%, and we'll make it through it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy, and I am, I guess, stage 0. My story is my mom had lung cancer, and they tested found T790 in her genes. So the doctor recommended that I get tested for that to see if I had that in my genetic makeup, and I did, and that provoked me to get a scan. And in that scan, I had some nodules in my lungs, and I had the largest one removed in January, and it was precancerous. So I'm very lucky to have, been able to have that blood test and find out in advance that something was going on. And in July, I had a 6-month scan, and because I have some other smaller nodules, and it's stable.
Hi, I'm Carrie's mom. Hi, I'm Renee. I'm Sandy's friend. I'm supporting here today. My name is Sandy, and about a year ago I was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and I am ALK positive. So I started taking the Xalkori, which I could never pronounce the technical name.
You did great.
And after 6 months of being on it, there's no sign of cancer in my body anywhere. And I just had my 3rd PET scan that shows I'm clear still. And I feel pretty good. And I'm so thankful.
I'm Gilles. I usually work on an online community for cancer patients called Smart Patients. But today I'm here because I'm Jack's driver.
Hi, I'm Tao, and I'm stage 3. I don't know, non-small cells. I had the lobectomy and radiation chemo, so my next CT scan is next week, so I will probably find out what happened.
My name's Mike Beecham, and as much as I love Colin Kaepernick, I'm here to support Jack because he's the type of guy that I want my sons to emulate and try to be when they grow up.
Vida? No? Real good? Okay, thank you all for making it quick, and like I said, we can kind of circle back to it as the meeting goes on. So I'm going to introduce Jack, and I'm going to actually read you guys a little bit about him. Sorry for the pasta stain on the paper. Oh, and for those of you who I haven't had a chance to talk to, who are wondering what happened to my face, I fell on Thursday night and broke my nose. The good news is the black and blue is all gone. The bad news is they just told me today they're gonna have to do surgery to fix it, so the black and blue will be back. So that's what happened to I broke my face.
And tripped over her son's bicycle trying to get into her house in the dark.
Yeah, and I smacked like straight into the slate stairs going up. It was terrible. It was awful, but that's all right. I still can't feel it. It's weird. Right. Okay, so. Dr. Jack West, for those of you who don't already know, is a medical oncologist and medical director of the thoracic oncology program at Swedish Cancer Institute in Seattle, Washington. He also serves as the president of the medical education website OncTalk and the global resource for advancing cancer education. And I know you guys have heard us talk about GRACE here, so that's Dr. West. Dr. West received an MPhil in experimental biology from Cambridge University on a Fulbright scholarship before returning to the U.S. to undertake his medical training at Harvard Medical School in Boston, where he earned his MD magna cum laude and conducted research as a Howard Hughes Medical Student Fellow. He stayed in Boston for his internship and residency in internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, then moved to Seattle, Washington for his fellowship in medical oncology at the Hutch. I shortened that. He moved to the Swedish Cancer Institute in Seattle in late 2002, where he directs the medical oncology component of the thoracic oncology program. Since 2007, he has been named one of the best doctors in Seattle by his regional medical colleagues. Dr. West maintains a strong clinical research focus on lung cancer. He currently serves as the principal investigator on several clinical trials of chemotherapy and novel agents and has authored numerous peer-reviewed as well as invited publications. He's been actively involved with the SWOG Lung Cancer Committee on multiple recent and ongoing protocols, and he leads several investigator-initiated trials at his own institution. In addition to his work in lung cancer, because that's not enough, he maintains a significant interest in clinical research and prostate cancer and genitourinary oncology. So with that mouthful,
And he has an amazing wife and three adorable children.
And is amazing on Twitter. I just want to say really quick. So I was on this I'm not a tweeter. I'm not even really sure what you're supposed to call it, but there's this LCSM lung cancer
tweet chat.
It's a tweet chat, right? And so I did it for my first time just last week, I think, right? And I got on, and most of you, or some of you know Darby, who works here for the foundation, and she does a lot of our social media stuff. So she was on with me, and I stayed at work, and I was doing it on my computer, and I was texting her the whole time thinking, my stuff's not showing up, I don't know what I'm doing, but I can say by the end of it, I think I figured it out. So I'm really excited for the next tweet chat that Dr. West also spearheads. So with that, Dr. West.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'll just say about coming down from Seattle. The Seattle quarterback, Russell Wilson, is typically referred to as the diminutive Russell Wilson, and he's 4 inches taller than I am. So that's it's like the only kid who dreamt of being 5'8", but didn't happen. So anyway, I do a lot of lung cancer. It's about 2/3 of my practice. I do some other things as well, but it's for more than a decade been a huge focus of my clinical work and my research, and I speak on it and write about it. But even so, the field has grown so much that it was something like 15, 18 months ago that I had first heard about the ROS1 rearrangement. Maybe it was 2 years ago. But however, whenever that was, it actually occurred by me learning about it from a patient online. And I am somebody who eats, sleeps, lives, and breathes lung cancer, and yet how did I learn about a new mutation? From somebody coming onto the GRACE website and talking about this, and then seeing a bit more about it. And it was not the first or the last time that I will learn something from a patient, even as someone with a significant expertise and focus in lung cancer. And it's just a different world we live in now, where nobody is going to have all of the information available to them. And that's, I think, a fundamental change. So I'm going to talk about that, but in truth, the talk is not a whole lot of data. It's really just a general discussion that I hope will really be a springboard for questions and answers. For centuries, the practice of medicine was a unidirectional one. You had doctors as the only people who had access to the information, and they would tell their patients what to do, and the patient would nod and be thankful for that. And that was the way things were for centuries or even millennia, but that was predicated on a couple of things. First, there being a finite amount of information to know. And second, that information was only available to the doctors. And that has completely changed in many ways. First of all, the amount of information that's out there has been growing at a remarkable, approaching exponential rate. I mean, this graph stops at 2010, but it's only escalated. So we no longer have a body of knowledge that is knowable by any one person. And we talk about IBM's Watson, the Jeopardy-winning algorithm that is being taught medicine because the human mind can't process all that's happening. And that's really a fundamental change. You see this graph escalating, and the fact is that we've had just such a remarkable multiplication of medical knowledge, and that's especially true in the field of cancer. Of course, that's a very good thing because it's leading to a lot of improvements, but one person's brain is now the bottleneck of it if we rely on that old system of what one person can read. When you have 180 or more journals in cancer, there's just so much coming out that even if you specialize in lung cancer or even EGFR, or I want to be a right middle lobeologist or something, you can't keep up with everything that's coming out. And that's a good situation as long as we can figure out a way to process all that's happening. But we can't live in the old model where we rely on one doctor in front of you in the exam room to know everything that there is to know. And I think it's also been a real challenge for doctors, too, to adapt to not necessarily knowing everything. That's not what Marcus Welby would have done. At the same time, the field of oncology has really changed. Cancer care has gone from lung cancer being defined by you have a cancer that started in the lung, to people going around the room talking about adenocarcinoma or squamous or EGFR, ALK, or T790M, or all of these things that were foreign concepts 8-10 years ago. And you have medicine moving from the circle on the left of just this muddy brown results. We didn't do very well 10-15 years ago. There was a lot more nihilism, even though there's stigma and challenges we have now. It's a lot better than it used to be, and there's just incredible momentum in the field of lung cancer. But 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when we just saw it as lung cancer in general, we got very muddy brown results, in part because we didn't see all the different colors of the spectrum, which when you mix them all together just come out as brown. So nowadays, we do a much better job of appreciating the different individual subtypes, though not completely. When you look at the pie chart on the top, we're starting to parse out EGFR mutation, ALK rearrangement, KRAS, which is the most common mutation, but we don't actually have a specific treatment for that yet, although there are things being studied right now. And then there are a whole bunch of smaller slivers. They don't show up very well to read, but at this point, almost none of them has a treatment in practice. We have ALK at about 4%. We have ROS1 now, just one I had mentioned as a 1 to 2%, and several others that are being looked at. But we still have another 40% or so where we haven't identified a mutation and we don't know enough about the mechanism. In fact, we don't know enough about the mechanism in many of these cases, but it's picking up speed all the time. And several of the treatments that have been most exciting in the field just didn't exist a few years ago. But this has made it incredibly more complex because for years, an oncologist in practice could manage lung cancer perfectly well by applying what they had done 5 or 10 years ago, and it wasn't really out of date. And we now have the enviable situation of so much information that it's hard for people to keep up with all of that. And there's mutations that we're learning about that people may or may not be tested for because they're oncologists, especially if they see 20 different cancers in the course of a day, can't possibly keep up with the pace of. There's also challenges with how oncology is practiced and research is conducted as we move from lung cancer not otherwise specified, just you have lung cancer and we divide just by non-small or small cell into ALK rearrangement, EGFR mutation, ROS, and even smaller populations potentially. For a very long time, we were studying very large populations in big studies of 1,000 patients or several hundred patients with advanced non-small cell. We didn't look at the histology or markers. And you just gave chemo X versus chemo Y. And that was available in studies in 200 centers across the country or around the world. And there are fewer and fewer of those studies nowadays because we are no longer concentrating on all comers nearly as much. We are doing more trials for not 80 or 100,000 potentially eligible people in the US, but hundreds or a few thousand people with an EGFR mutation or acquired resistance to crizotinib or something like that. How are we going to do those trials for patients who are spread out all over the place? And there are just not going to be 50 people within the city who are eligible for any one trial. On the upside, in the past when we were looking for significant differences, what passed for significant was debatable whether it was really clinically significant, even if it was statistically significant. You might get an improvement in survival of 6 weeks. Well, that's good, but that's not astonishing, and it's nothing we could beat our chest about. And when you'd see improvements in response rates, the degree of tumor shrinking by 5%, well, that's okay. But with several of these targeted therapies, if you actually use the right targeted therapy in the right targeted population, all of a sudden you're looking at response rates of 50, 70, 80%. And these responses don't just last for 2 or 3 months and then fade away. They can be for 9, 12, or more months. And there are people we've heard about here today, and I know other patients, people I keep up with in my clinic or other people I know personally who have been beneficiaries of some of these treatments that last for years. And it's turning even metastatic disease into more of a chronic disease, which is a big step. Even if it's not curative, turning the prognosis from months to years is a big step, and providing that hope is a big help. As I'd mentioned, when you do studies of chemotherapy plus or minus new drug X for everybody with lung cancer, you can run those trials all over, but when you're looking for people with an ALK rearrangement or a ROS mutation or something, you're now looking, you're not going to be able to run that every place because most centers aren't going to have more than 1 or 2 patients all year who fit these criteria. And so you end up having the challenge of running some of these very specialized trials at 3 or 4 or 5 centers in an entire continent. And that's just the way it is. But it's something that we are going to have to contend with as we try to get these trials done, because you just can't run trials for 1% subgroups in 300 centers in North America. And then finally, there's the issue of just awareness of the trials and the markers. At the time 10 years ago when it was chemo plus or minus drug X, the doctor at any cancer center in the region might know about the only couple of trials that were available. But now, your oncologist is very unlikely to know about every trial that is potentially relevant to you if you have acquired resistance to a particular targeted therapy or a rare mutation. And it's just not feasible to expect that the doctor's going to know every trial that might be available, especially if that trial is outside of the state as the closest institution. So against this backdrop, we also have people going online. Dr. Google is everyone's favorite doctor now. I mean, it's this is 2011 numbers, or 81% of adults in the U.S. go to Google for healthcare information, and that's lower than it would be today. And it's a huge change from what we saw a decade earlier. And that's a very democratizing, powerful thing. It also completely changes the dynamic in the field. The challenge, and I think in truth a lot of doctors are not that welcoming of Dr. Google. Many doctors will tell stories of their fear when they see someone come in with reams of printed pages from the internet and what that means. And I think it's a double-edged sword. The internet's not different from television or newspapers in that there's a huge range in the quality of what you'll find out there. And some of it is not so good. You'll see things that advertise curing any form of cancer and don't talk about chemo and radiation and surgery. These are poison, and there are some easy answers to very difficult questions out there that I think are tempting to gravitate towards when in desperation. I mean, this is a scary thing. And so that's a challenge that I think many doctors are fearful about, that people will find lousy information online. And one of the other challenges here, it says, thank you for not mentioning Dr. Oz, which I think has become more apropos now than it was even a few years ago, because sometimes the most telegenic or star-driven proselytizing is not necessarily the most knowledgeable. So that is a real issue, but at the same time, there can be amazing information out there, and I think many of the people in the room have found that or are actively putting it out there too. So it can be a phenomenal tool if we use it properly. At the same time, I think that doctors, many are somewhat fearful that their roles are going to be usurped, but in fact, that's not really what the data show. The data, when you speak to patients and caregivers, physicians are still the most trusted source for information about who to see, treatments to pursue. It's just not the only source anymore. But I think that the dynamic should be more collecting data together and then discussing where to go from there. So you can see really high percentages, up to 90% or 60 to 90% for a lot of these key medical decisions are not meant to obviate the doctor, but just to integrate them. So back in 2007, I had started GRACE, Global Resource for Advancing Cancer Education. It was really the idea behind it was to provide an online source where people could find vetted, credible information that was available anytime for free to people, as timely as it could be, pushing out information and also providing an opportunity for people to ask questions. And it started out in lung cancer because that's what I focused on as my primary interest, but it was never meant to be exclusive to that. I mean, the concept of getting good information out to people wherever they are is not exclusive to lung cancer, but it was really largely born out of the challenge of seeing too many patients treated less than the best possible with the tools we have available. Of course, emerging research is extremely exciting, but the fact is we don't do as well as we can do with the treatments and the tools we have now, and that is partly because there's a big gulf between the best treatment available and what is actually delivered in the world. That could be because the doctors are not aware of the tests to, the molecular markers or the best treatments. It sometimes can be that there are treatments that are pay better than others, but that may be a factor in some cases. But for whatever the reason, the idea was to try to put out information directly to patients and caregivers, not to tell them what to do, but to say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. You can take that, discuss it with your doctor, see how it meshes with what you're hearing, and in many cases, it would corroborate what people were hearing from their own doctors. But that in itself can be a comforting thing. If you're told that this is not a curable cancer, you might think, well, it's not curable here, but if I go to Memorial Sloan Kettering or MD Anderson, I'm sure it is, but then you find out, well, no, the best treatment we have is exactly what your doctor in Billings, Montana suggested for you. I think that is somewhat comforting. And in some cases, it might offer some new ideas that people haven't thought about. It's hopefully gives an idea of which patients might want to get a second opinion versus feel comforted by what they're hearing without necessarily having to leave town or wherever to get that information. It's gone on and built momentum. Happily, we just hired an executive director we're going to be announcing and transitioning from founder run to run by professional, dedicated people with me still heavily involved. But I also wanted to convey that Grace is not the only place doing this, and there are many organizations, and this is just really the tip of the proverbial iceberg, of great resources online, and they offer different things. And I had actually, when I started Grace, envisioned it as the place to come for medical information and not as much of a support community. Not that I think that's not a valuable thing, but because I thought other people are already doing this well. What I did not foresee was that it would organically become somewhat of a support community, that people do become attached to each other, and that is part of the secret sauce of what it has been. And I think that many of these groups are a combination of information seeking and exchange, but also connection, emotional connection and support. I mean, many of the people, there are not many opportunities to get so many people with similar experiences in the same room. And that's especially true if you have a rare mutation. So the opportunity to get people together, even in a virtual community, I think has been very valuable. What we're moving toward is really a bi-directional model where it's no longer, here's what I think you should do, you nod happily and go forth and say whatever you say, doc. Nowadays, even this is somewhat simplified, of having the patient come in and talk about what they're interested in. What we actually have is a network model where the patient is at the center of this, because the patient is getting information not just from the doctor, but from the various online communities that he or she is involved with, learning about new clinical trial options, hearing about different chemo agents potentially, But coming back to the room and having the exam room and having an entire community's worth of information involved, so that the online community is basically the third party in the exam room along with the patient and the doctor. So it is a much richer net of information out there because this group of people is going to have incredibly more information than just one doctor or a doctor and a patient alone. I wrote an article about a year and a half ago with Dr. Ross Camage, who was honored by Bonnie and the organization here last year. He's great and has really helped move the field forward. And we talked about the challenges we are facing in this new molecular oncology era. The article was "Half Mutation Will Travel." And the issue was talking largely about people finding out that they have an ALK rearrangement, but being in a different state from an opportunity to get that treatment. And what we saw is in the map there of people coming from all over the country converging on Denver to get a therapy like crizotinib. That would not have been something that I would have ever recommended for somebody in the era of chemotherapy plus or minus who knows what for everybody, because those trials were aspiring to show a 6 or 7 week survival benefit, and they were completely unselected populations, and they offered very marginal promise to a very broad population, and it wasn't worth getting on a plane for them. This kind of treatment that with a targeted therapy that could potentially melt away tumors and keep it that way for many months or years at a time suddenly changed the stakes enough that it was worth going to where the trial was. We still have challenges with that because ideally we wouldn't want to have these novel agents only be available to the people who have the means physically, support-wise, financially to travel to New York or Boston or Denver or wherever to get these. But that's a challenge that I think we're still going to have to overcome. We also have challenges with generating enough interest in the pharma biotech world to study 1% populations. It's a smaller market than standard chemotherapy that is broadly applied to 100,000 people in the US every year. So these are drugs that might only be applicable for 1,000 people, and it's much harder to do trials of a few dozen or 100 or more people to ultimately capture a market that is relatively small. They are a business. They certainly do want to do good things, but it can be a practical challenge to run these trials. Time-wise, they don't want to be encumbered with trials that take years and years to get completed, only to get on a very small market, into a very small market. But I also think that the online world is a great opportunity to revolutionize how we do research. As I'd mentioned, I learned about the ROS1 rearrangement, a 1.5% opportunity, a 1.5% population, from a patient with it. And these patients, and many patients with ALK rearrangements or other unusual mutations, are finding each other online. Some rare histologies like sarcomatoid histology, which I don't think anyone had mentioned here, are connecting with each other online and telling each other about, this worked for me and you should try it too. And in fact, there's some promising leads that I and patients are learning about from not their doctor, but from people like them. And the great thing about the internet is it bridges that geographic distance. So if you have one of these rare mutations and you find out that someone is tolerating a therapy well and showing a very good response, that has the promise of accelerating research where all these people participating in the same discussion group, even if it's a 1 or 2% group, are talking to each other about this or that trial that they're involved with at Mass General or in Colorado or MD Anderson or wherever. And amazingly, it's getting to the point where the patients will know more than any doctor out there, not just the doctor in the community treating everything, but even the doctors involved with the trials. I am involved with trials with some novel agents, and I might have 3 or 4 patients on the trial, and that's a lot of experience. That's more than anyone else in the city or state. But the patients with some of these mutations are talking to each other online with people from other centers. So they might have experience with 8 or 9 different people at different courses along the treatment to be finding out how long people are benefiting from them, how well tolerated the treatment is, ways to deal with side effects that, with me having seen one person with a side effect of the 4 that I've treated, I wouldn't have that experience. And so we can have patients leading doctors by the nose toward optimal therapies. And this is, we've never had this before. So it's a great tool of getting patients together, finding each other online, actually facilitating research by talking about promising clinical trials that they're involved with, talking about managing side effects. I think that many of the people who have been on Tarceva for a very long time become experts in managing the skin side effects or other issues that doctors just can't know. I mean, there's a certain experience, there's a certain expertise that comes from experience, and I think that the online communities where you get patients talking about different products they've used, tricks they've found, is inestimably helpful, probably better than just about any oncologist out there in terms of experience in dealing with these issues. There's about 1 or 2 dermatologists who specialize in this. And other than that, the patients are going to be bigger experts than anybody else. And so go to the source. I think we all have our own expertise. And Gilles has talked about the term micro-expert, which I think is a very apt term to talk about. You might have an expertise in the trials about acquired resistance for EGFR mutations, but you probably know more about that by looking online for this for a half hour or hour a day than just about any oncologist who is trying to manage the issues around 150 different patients in a given month. So these are some of the potential opportunities. I would also say that when you have groups who self-aggregate, if you get 20 different people with a ROS1 rearrangement who are saying, we're here for clinical trials, pick me, all of a sudden that might make it a lot easier for a drug company with a novel agent to think they can actually do a study on a few dozen people because they connect with this group and the people come en masse to complete a trial. There's now precedent of some rare conditions that are completing trials instantly because the group of patients is already there trying to get people to notice them in the pharma world. And so I think that having these groups ready and available and motivated to pursue clinical trials will significantly lower the barriers for the pharma companies to pursue these trials even in small populations. And then I'd also put up the logo for Consano, which is a new website that's basically doing crowdsourced medical research opportunities. And that could be a way to go where we have people with what would be considered these days an orphan situation, a too rare disease to get much notice for conventional research, themselves generating the funds or having family, friends, anybody involved who is willing to contribute to do a pilot study of a novel agent in a rare subgroup that's too small to ever otherwise get the notice of some of these larger companies. So that is just starting to take off, but I think that's another potential avenue to getting research done in a way that it was never able to be done before. Dr. Camage and I raised the question of if we could possibly start doing telemedicine consults, at least to explore eligibility for patients. If you're in a smaller town, before flying to Denver to find out whether you're eligible for a trial or not, maybe you could do some of the initial screening remotely and then just come to wherever the trial is actually being conducted for the work that has to be done there, to get the drugs, to get intermittent visits, but for as much as possible to not require people to get on a plane weekly for things that don't really need to be done weekly in person. We don't do nearly as much with telemedicine as we have the promise to do, and that is certainly a limitation of just people not necessarily easily being able to have the financial resources or physical ability to get on and off a plane every week to participate in these clinical trials. I'd even raised the question of just, it might be so straightforward to have people donate airline miles and create a network of people who would be willing to house someone in their city who's coming for a clinical trial so that they didn't go bankrupt to stay in New York or Boston or San Francisco or Seattle to do a clinical trial. These are not rocket science ideas, but it's just, there are ways that we can approach this that could fundamentally change how research is conducted and change the pace, because right now we only have about 2% of patients with lung cancer going on clinical trials. That's an incredible challenge, and if we doubled that, we would double the rate at which new drugs become available for everybody. I'd mentioned in a prior slide that we have to change the expectations that the FDA may have about approving clinical trials, but I think that's starting to happen. Historically, the FDA would require randomized phase 3 trials with hundreds of patients showing statistically significant differences between old treatment and new treatment. And that's still ideally what you'd like to have, but there's now a growing precedent that the FDA, as conservative as it may need to be, has become more open to changing the threshold for new drugs becoming available. This is Xalkori, crizotinib, and we have people here who are huge beneficiaries of it. The EML4 ALK rearrangement was only initially detected 6 years ago in a lab, and it was in 2009 it first started getting out in the earliest clinical trials, and 2 years later was approved really based on incredible results in phase 2 work, phase 1 and 2 studies, not the completed results of randomized trials. But it's a lot easier to do that for the FDA to say, look, we're not stupid here. We can see that a 60% response rate, 90% disease control, and a huge proportion of the people started on it still without progression 6 or 9 months later. This is going to change practice. That at least sets up a precedent that we don't need to do studies of hundreds or thousands of people when you're talking about a population that is only 2 or 4% of lung cancer. We're going to need to be open to that new line of research and hopefully get those kind of results that are irrefutably excellent, because it led to, I think, a very hearteningly short time before the drug or even the target went from a concept to a targetable approach and then a clinically available drug not very long after. There's an Aesop's fable called the Hound and the Hare, and it's about a shepherd who's out with his dog, and they see a hare, and he sends the dog off to catch it, and he gives a good chase, runs around for a while, but eventually the hare gets away. And he says to the Hound, "How could you do that? I mean, he's small. You should have gotten him." And the Hound replies, "Well, you don't see the difference. I was just running for dinner, but he was running for his life." But I think, thank you. But I think it's important to recognize that nobody has more invested in this than the patients. I mean, I care deeply about my patients. I want to do right by them, but I can't spend hours and hours every day on one patient. I treat a lot of everything, and that's even as focusing on lung cancer, but the one patient has the opportunity to focus on their field, what matters most to them, with incredible focus. And it makes great sense to leverage and capitalize on that motivation as long as patients are equipped with the best knowledge. As long as it's out there, it's criminal to not capitalize on that and incorporate patient knowledge, ideally sharing a lot of it through online resources so that we can together come up with the best care options. So in summary, I would say that relationships between patients and physicians are completely changing. And I think that it's going to be an adjustment process for patients and for doctors to recognize that it's okay for the doctors to not know everything that there is to know about that, but at the same time, also for patients and caregivers to not expect that or feel that their doctor's deficient for not being able to recite chapter and verse about every 1% mutation or every trial. It's just not feasible. That was feasible when lung cancer's management was 2 or 3 pages in a big textbook. But it's not feasible now. And we need to come into this saying that we're a team and we're going to do this together. I will find out what I can, bring me back what you can find, and let's talk about it. I think that doctors should have the experience to help filter the data and talk about the relative benefits. There are certainly things that experience provides, but it's not a monopoly on all the good information out there.
Jack, what would you say to a patient that says, "I don't want to hurt my doctor's feelings"?
Well, I think that in terms of getting a second opinion, for instance, or questioning them?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that it's that the doctor has to get over that, and or the patient caregiver has to get over that, that in truth, that is part of the process, especially when it's really high stakes. I think that cancer is a field that really lends itself very well to seeking other opinions online or in person or both, because there are rarely extreme emergencies. I mean, you can't go online to do a search for crushing substernal chest pain when you have it. You just have to treat that. But cancer is a potentially life-threatening, very often life-threatening situation, but one that plays out over enough time that you shouldn't have to make decisions in the heat of the moment, hopefully. And so I would say that those of us who do this all the time, who focus on lung cancer or any other cancer, we do lots of second opinions, and we don't consider it an affront to their doctor that they would come to us. And very often what we'll say is, no, Dr. Smith is doing perfectly appropriate treatment. And I would do exactly the same treatment. I might give the exact same drugs. I don't think that my patients who come to me and hear that feel like it was a waste of their time. It's very validating, it's very comforting just to know that there's nothing missed. And so when people ask about that on the Grace website, for instance, I'll say, well, you'll either be told that what you're getting makes great sense, or you'll get another option. I think that there's no downside to that. But I have patients get second opinions after seeing me, and I don't consider that a challenge to my ego. I would say that particularly when these are life and death situations, it's completely appropriate, if not critical, to get as much corroborating information as you can. The other thing I'd say is that there are rarely situations where someone will ask, what should I do? And I can emphatically say, this is what you need to do, and that's the way it is. There's, your top three choices are X, X, and X. It's not that way. There's very often nuances of different regimens that have pluses and minuses. And in fact, when we'll have panel discussions with 3 experts or 4 experts on the panel, you might get 3 or 4 different answers, sometimes 5, of what's the right thing to do. But it's not like we think the other person's an idiot. It's usually that somebody else's top choice was my second choice, and we're still debating with ourselves about the pros and cons. The other thing I'd say is that what is right for one patient may be not right for another. Everyone comes in with different values of how much toxicity they're willing to put up with, their own set of values. And so by the same token, I don't think there's any one center or one doctor who's the best doctor for anybody, because I have my own style that's more forthright. I don't want to bludgeon anybody, but it's not for everybody. It resonates with many people, but it's not perfect. And I don't think there is any one doctor who's perfect for everybody. So I would say it's always a great idea. And if anybody does have a doctor who takes umbrage about a second opinion, that's their shortcoming, really.
Dr. West, I have a question for you. To me, it seems that molecular and genetic testing is becoming more and more important as far as helping determine what is the appropriate treatment for patients as far as their chemotherapies. And the reason why I ask this question is that now a couple friends of mine have been recently diagnosed with lung cancer, and in both circumstances, I've been trying to help them get molecular and genetic testing done, one of which was diagnosed very recently for the first time. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to go ahead and just do the regular kind of blast it with chemo and then try to take the tumor out. And I was trying to convince them, well, why don't, before they do that, they take it out, why don't they test it? Because I've been in biotech field, and I know that the first round of chemo is extremely important, and why not try to get them the most appropriate treatment the first time around versus kind of doing catch-up when it reoccurs. So can you kind of talk about the philosophy and hopefully how the I don't know if it's the market or the physicians or even the insurance companies, how that plays a role, because I think the biggest issue in both cases was that the insurance companies were really fighting against this type of testing.
It is an area that is still hotly debated. The fact is that these molecular markers are really only established or standard of care for metastatic disease. So we still debate in our own lung cancer tumor boards whether to do testing on someone who has had surgery for a stage 1 or 2 cancer, for instance, or has what appears to be stage 3 disease. There is not evidence at this point that it is ideal or appropriate to give these targeted therapies as an alternative to standard chemo in as adjuvant postoperative therapy, even if you find someone has an EGFR mutation or an ALK rearrangement, it is not established that giving these therapies instead of chemo before potential surgery or with radiation for stage 3 be done. That absence of proof is not proof of absence. So that is one issue. I think that in individual situations, it makes sense to have a very careful discussion. If you have a compelling rationale and an understanding patient, I think the key thing is not to over-represent what we know, but to say, here's some principles and here's why we might do it. Now, I know that I actually had a patient or a colleague of mine who I trained with ask me about what would you do for a stage 3A patient with an ALK rearrangement? And I said, well, technically the answer is you do chemo-based treatment with radiation, consider surgery, whatever. And I said, well, that said, would I ever consider crizotinib? Yeah, absolutely I would. But that's not the textbook answer right now, but I think it's certainly a compelling thing to think about. The challenge is that when they have looked at well-done studies, for instance, there was a study of chemo and radiation for stage 3 lung cancer done by the Southwest Oncology Group, and after the chemo and radiation, half the people got Iressa, which was the EGFR inhibitor of the time, and half got placebo. This was pre-molecular marker testing, but it was a drug that had been shown to shrink cancers in some cases dramatically, and it was really thought that it's either going to work or it won't work, but it's not going to hurt anyone. Well, except that it did. In fact, the placebo arm had a median survival that was 12 months better than the Iressa arm. There is nobody in the field who would have imagined that was possible. And had we just treated everyone off the cuff without doing the study, we might have been harming a lot of people because it was not something we could have envisioned. That came up again when there was a study that was actually just reported in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, our big flagship journal, about giving the same drug, Iressa or gefitinib, after surgery for patients with early stage lung cancer that was resected. That study was closed early because of the one I just mentioned that showed this detrimental effect that we couldn't imagine. It stopped with patients having received an average of five months of either Iressa or placebo. And that also showed a not significant trend toward a worse survival in the recipients of the placebo. Very surprising, except thinking about the stage 3 study. But what was most concerning about that was they looked at the patients with an EGFR mutation, where we would have thought, well, absolutely, if you look at those patients, they would be different. They had a worse survival still. The worst survival difference between the recipients of Iressa and placebo was in the patients with an EGFR mutation. Now, maybe that was because the trial stopped early and they came off and rebounded with progression, but we don't really know why, and nobody would have expected that. And that's why we would potentially be cautious. It should be a humbling moment for us to think we aren't as smart as we think we are, because anybody would imagine that before this that Iressa would be neutral or beneficial but not harmful, even in a broad population, but absolutely in the patients who have an EGFR mutation. But we were wrong. And so that makes us a little more cautious about leaping ahead of the data, even when the rationale is compelling. And I'm not saying that you can't or shouldn't extrapolate beyond the data, but I'm saying that's part of the rationale why people who don't do that aren't necessarily idiots.
My question is that, with breast cancer and prostate cancer, they're doing these type of tests, when people are diagnosed. And and I understand what you're saying with the trials, it can be very problematic, but at least finding out what the genetic and molecular profile of the tumor is.
Right.
If you're removing the tissue, why not take it and send it for the testing so that if this primary round doesn't work or they have progression or whatever, you're ahead of the game versus waiting for the tumor to come back and then get large enough again so that you can biopsy it, and then you're behind the 8 ball.
That's certainly a reasonable argument as well. I think the only issue with that is if 18 months or 2 years go by between that and the recurrence, is what recurred the same as what you biopsied? I mean, we also know that there's heterogeneity within the same tumor. There have been studies of, and this is very disconcerting, but you can see differences between pulmonary nodule A and pulmonary nodule C or D. I mean, there isn't a perfect concordance, even if they're done at the same time, let alone done a year or two apart. So what the cancer you have as a resectable one in 2011 may be different from the recurrent one in 2013. I'm not saying it makes no sense to do it, but in general, if asked, when would you prefer, if I had tissue available from 2013 and 2011, I would always prefer to do the molecular marker studies on the most current tissue because I think that's going to be most representative of what you're dealing with today. Yeah. Gilles, I don't know if you wanted to call on.
Is the cost too prohibitive to do that? Is that the reason that they're not doing that? Because I think treating something with blindfolds on is ridiculous.
I would say it's not really just that. For instance, people will often get PET scans done constantly all the time for metastatic disease. And I am among many specialists who think that they're largely overdone for following metastatic disease every 2 or 3 months. And the reason isn't because I can't get them paid for. The reason is because they give so much information that is hard to interpret and often leads to bad decisions. In other words, I will sometimes see patients who are tolerating a therapy very well with no progression of any nodules based on the size or nothing new appearing, but the standard uptake value, the metabolic activity, will go up from 4 to 5. And somebody will be taken off of the treatment because they're progressing on it. We don't have so many excellent therapies that we should be that anxious to toss perfectly good treatments. And my worry is that this is like changing lanes in traffic just for the sake of doing something. And my concern about some of these, if we don't know what to do with this information, prostate cancer is not as commonplace as where it's used in breast cancer for molecular signatures and determining should we do treatment or should we not. But in breast cancer, those studies have been done specifically testing the value of sending off the molecular profile to clarify whether it helps you make better decisions about whether to do chemo or not after surgery. And there are people who are doing similar kind of studies in lung cancer. I'm completely in favor of those studies. My concern is that in the absence of the results of those studies, I don't think we do a lot better than shooting blind. We, at this year's ASCO, got the results of 2 big studies that looked at whether we do better in picking a specific chemo regimen based on molecular markers like ERCC1 and RM1 versus just saying everyone gets carbo plus a taxane, for instance, or carbo plus gemcitabine. There's a reasonable amount of information out there saying that ERCC1 and RM1 can be helpful to pick which patients are going to do better with which chemo. But there hasn't been a prospective study until these. And both of these studies, one done in the US and one done in Spain, showed that the strong trend was in favor of the patients who just everyone got the same thing. Again, the numbers were very, if you saw the curves or saw the outcomes, you'd say, I want to be on this arm. But it's not the arm that you thought it would be. It was the arm that didn't have the testing and everyone got standard treatment. So my concern is that until we actually do the studies, we're not that clever yet that we know the results. And too often, it backfires on us. So cost is an issue, but I think cost is a lot more compelling to overcome when we are convinced that it's actually helping people. What I'm concerned about is cost of treatments that are actually leading us to do worse with our therapies. And as I said, I can do PET scans all the live long day. I just don't think they make better decisions for me, and sometimes they lead me to make worse decisions, which is why they're useful. They're a great tool in certain situations, but I would say that any cancer that isn't growing and there's no new lesions is not experiencing clinically significant progression. But too often I'd see them misused as a tool that makes you can't unknow what you see there, and it leads you to make bad choices.
Through my ignorance, all of the trials are approved by CDC or FDA before they're commenced, or FDA. As such, do they provide the database so someone could go online to those databases to see what trials are active and what the synopses of the trials are through one of those?
There are websites like clinicaltrials.gov and some other ones that clinicaltrials.gov is an advertisement for a different user interface than clinicaltrials.gov. So, I mean, we definitely need something better, and there are people who are actively working on better ways to match patients to trials. That is incredibly attractive as a concept. What we don't have, though, is the results of all the trials that have been done available for many reasons. Trials that are negative don't get written up very, very much. And when they are written up and they're submitted to journals, they often don't get published because they aren't as interesting as the positive trials. So there's a lot of data out there sitting in drawers and on hard drives that no one knows about because they aren't prioritized if they aren't going to be published in a sexy journal because they didn't turn out with the right results. So that's an issue of publication bias, and it absolutely exists. And there are smart people talking about how doctors and patients and everyone consuming the literature, even with all that's out there, what is published is not necessarily representative of all that is or should be known, because a lot of it never got published because it didn't show what we were hoping it would show.
Along those lines, once a drug gets approved, if things get lost, like I had applied to get on the ARIA trial and she wouldn't let me because one of the side effects was they'd had a couple of deaths related to shortness of breath, and she was afraid, even though that was like less than 1% of the people, she said if you have that, it could be fatal or do permanent damage. Once that drug gets approved, does those kinds of things seem like they kind of get lost when you go for the treatment, or do they? Yeah, I don't know that, it's something that's like less than 1% side effect that they're going to recognize that, hey, maybe you shouldn't take this drug because of X, Y, Z. I mean, you can decide to override it, I would think, as a patient, but it would be nice that you know that.
No, I think it's a real issue of, there's a lot of things that are below, that are in the really low numbers that are just not detected enough. I was talking with Gilles and Bonnie about earlier about how online discussions can also potentially help identify side effects that docs aren't that attuned to because they might not be severe enough, even if they're cumulatively annoying to patients. If they don't land you in the ER or they aren't on the list of things that we regularly ask about on trials, you might never know that lots and lots of people on Tarceva get runny nose, or people on Avastin get achy or things like that. I have learned a lot from online communities about side effects that I think are not reported and that most oncologists would just never know about because they aren't publicized or they aren't considered to be alarming enough that you'd get black box warnings about runny nose. But to your point, I would say that it really depends on the situation. I mean, we've been dealing, Avastin is associated with a 1 or 2% risk of life-threatening or fatal bleeding complications, and that doesn't mean that we don't prescribe it. It's just something that we want to talk with patients about, and we need to carefully judge whether a patient has increased risk factors like coughing up blood, which would be a big red X about not wanting to do that, where people would, if we gave a drug like Avastin, which can help some people, to the wrong people, we'd kill a lot more than we would help. So it's certainly something we need to be cautious about. These are all drugs that have potentially high stakes.
Yeah, that one's actually an interesting one because my girlfriend was on it for breast cancer, and then it was disapproved, and she's been on Avastin for 3 years with actually very minimal side effects, and she would otherwise probably be dead by now. And her doctor and they are very upset because they didn't approve it for breast cancer and it's approved for lung cancer. And it's like, well, the alternative is I might die if I take this, but if I don't, I'm dead for sure. And and yet, especially where it's approved for other cancers, it's. And I asked my doctor about Avastin for lung cancer, and he said, "Oh, there's only a 2-month improvement," or he didn't seem. Which I was kind of curious where that is used in lung cancer, because I see some people that basically have the same thing. They gave it initially along with the carboplatin or cisplatin and atinib. As with the chemo, you see some people where they throw Tarceva or Avastin in, and then some people they don't on first-line chemo. I was curious, why is that? When do they decide to use that, or what's
Well, it's pretty individual. There was one study in North America that showed a survival benefit for it, but there have been other studies since then that haven't. And so it's not entirely clear which is an outlier, what to believe. And I think it is largely considered to be an option, but not a clear absolute mandate, given that there have been some other large randomized trials that have not shown a survival benefit. I think the totality of the data, in my estimate, is compared with what we first saw from it in 2005 or 2006 with one positive trial, it's not all that. I mean, if it were really that good, it would have shown a survival benefit in more than one trial. So I use it in some patients, but I don't consider it an inviolable required component at all. And I think its added benefit for a lot of patients is very modest. And particularly some studies of older patients, older than 70, have shown that it really doesn't provide any survival benefit and may give disproportionately greater side effects. So there's plenty of room for judgment. Did you have questions from that?
I just wanted to ask a question from somebody online, since we're kind of in that clinical trial space right now. They'd like to know what the reason is why, if there's a trial in another city, why can't the local oncologist just follow trial protocol and report findings back to the trial for purposes of that trial?
Because legally it's prohibited is a short answer. But besides that, I would have to say following a trial is harder than following a recipe. I mean, it's really, really detailed, and even at the places that do clinical research all the time, there are small deviations pretty frequently. And for the places that don't do clinical trials all the time, it would probably be a fiasco. I mean, honestly, there's so much detail with if somebody's lab values come out a little different, you need to do this differently, hold the drug, cut the drug, whatever. It's extremely detailed, and it requires a lot of coordination of people. And once that gets decentralized to people who, especially to people who are not doing these trials all day long, you'd end up with uninterpretable results where a huge amount of what was intended to happen didn't happen as intended. And you'd probably end up with even good drugs failing to show the benefit because so much got muddied when things were not done in a uniform fashion. So it's really that, the clinical trials require a comparable group of people to be treated in a uniform fashion. And even when you have vetted places being tightly regulated, there's deviations because life happens and things slip between the cracks of, the rules. You can try to anticipate everything, but you never can. And then when you add in a layer or two of people who don't run these trials all the time and don't have study teams in contact with the company that runs the trial, you end up with people getting the wrong treatment, wrong dose, and an uninterpretable mess, which would be a terrible waste if you run all these studies and all these people participate and you can't interpret the results after years.
I was wondering, as a kind of along those lines, and I agree that you need to go to the trial and see the doctor and stuff, but when the trial I was looking at was a pill, and some of the times it's just a blood test, and it was like I had to go do 2 blood tests because one was with my provider who wouldn't pay for the standard stuff, one was with the trial stuff where they're testing all the things related to the study medicine, and I understand that. But the gal says, and I says, well, could I get that blood test up at my regular doctor? And she says, no, I have those vials and I control them. It seems like just the blood tests where you're on like a pill, you'd still have to go back every so often, but maybe not as often for the blood test. You'd still want to go back so that the doctor can see you and track you for, at reasonable intervals. But it would at least take a few trips away for the people that are traveling these long distances.
I agree that that's one of the things that Dr. Camage and I are hoping that can happen is to have a very careful assessment of what really needs to be done at the trial center, and anything that can be done, if it's blood pressure checks or whatever, anything that can be done over the phone or via a HIPAA-compliant Skype connection or something like that, or using the doc at home by proxy for anything that's possible, that would be a desirable thing. I mean, if we aren't going to get to the point where you don't need to ever see the patient, but if you could cut it by half or 2/3 or something, that would be a great improvement. Gilles, do you have that?
Follow-up question on clinical trials. What do you think of the situation that we have now, where the only people who believe that you still have double-blind clinical trials are the people that prepare the trials, while everybody else, including the patients, know that it's no longer, there is no blind trials anymore, since they all discuss online their participation in the trials and the side effects, and within a certain period of time, they know that if you're in this arm, you may have this kind of side effects. If you're in another arm, you should expect this.
Well, I think that it's certainly a limiting factor. I mean, that's been that way for a long time, that people who are on trials of EGFR inhibitors knew that if they were getting a rash, they would high-five each other. And, and even before that, people on HIV trials would split their drugs so that they could at least be guaranteed that they could get half of the active drug. So these are real issues, but I think that from a trialist standpoint, the fact is, when we're doing these trials, we can honestly say we don't know which is going to be better. And that's not just a half-hearted party line. We have seen lots of studies where the new drug is not better than the old drug, and some where it's clearly worse. As I mentioned, I don't have to look very far to think of trials where I wish I were on the placebo arm, and if the company making placebo were taking investments, they would do very well. So, I mean, we have these trials because we should have the equipoise to be able to say, for a trial I have, for instance, of nivolumab and immunotherapy versus docetaxel, Taxotere, as a second-line treatment, I know that a lot of people would prefer to be on the novel treatment side. But the other arm of the trial is not negligible treatment. It is the best treatment we can identify now against something that may surpass it, maybe equal, maybe lesser. So I know that as long as there's human behavior, there will want to game the system. And I know that people are randomized sometimes to the arm they didn't want and drop off a trial, whether that is in a supposedly blinded trial not getting the side effects they wanted within 3 weeks, or in some of these open trials, open label, where you're getting this treatment or that treatment, you get the standard arm and you give up. But honestly, the fact is that we wouldn't be doing these trials if we knew the answer, and all too often we're reminded that the arm that everyone wanted to be on is not the better arm. It's enough of a humbling situation to still feel like we need to do these trials to know the right thing, and that's going to ultimately be the way that these trials prove themselves as new agents and become available for everybody else.
I have a question.
Sure, David.
It's a thought, really, and I don't want to think it through too much because I'll discard it, so I'm just going to say it or ask it. So we're all in treatment, or most of us in some form or fashion, in trial, out of trial. Is data being collected about us that are not in trials, that are just going through treatment, that have, success or not success, or so that information is being used on a global scale to benefit others, right? Beyond a trial, right?
The short answer is not really.
Right.
It could and should it be? Yeah. I think that some centers, primarily academic centers, not exclusively, will look at their case series of the last 50 or 100 people treated with Xalkori or treated with surgery and had certain characteristics, and saw that all the people who had sarcomatoid histology ended up doing this or that. So that can certainly happen in retrospective ways. I do think that the big data approach of people going to sites like Patients Like Me or similar things, I don't know if there's others doing this, where they're trying to pool data and just say, here's my characteristics, here's what happened to me. That would be a big benefit. We're starting to do a little more of this. There's a website called mycancergenome.org, which was put together by a colleague of mine, William Powell, who is a very good researcher at Vanderbilt, who created basically a database warehouse of mutations, some common, some far less common, especially focused on the less common ones, not just in lung cancer, but melanoma and all sorts of cancers, talking about what little is known about some of these rarer mutations on exon 20 of EGFR or whatever, so that researchers, clinicians, patients, caregivers can go there and say, hey, I've got an S768I mutation in EGFR, and there's really not much written about that. What's the experience? And that, the first iteration of that was really just controlled content going out from Vanderbilt. I think the new iteration is bringing in solicited content from other people, so it's more of a wiki experience where people can say, hey, I had 2 patients who were involved, who had this mutation, and here was my experience treating them with Tarceva, and you can add that to the database. That's, I hope, where we're going, but it's...
To Dr. West's point and yours, if less than 6% of people with cancer, all cancer, participate in clinical trials, and that's the data we do have, imagine if we were collecting data on the other 94%. And it was going into a centralized database. And then we were collating that information. And all of a sudden, some really amazing information started popping out. People with blue eyes, more often have the EGFR mutation. Now, of course, that's an exaggeration, and don't leave here thinking that's the case. But all of a sudden, we would start getting some real interesting information involving where you're born, what country, what nationality you are, all kinds of things. Data, in my mind, is key. Key to the solution.
I want to tag on to that, because you guys have all heard me talk about Cancer Commons, and Gilles kind of looked at me as Jack was talking, like, do it, do it, do it. And Cancer Commons is the organization that we partnered with, along with Gilles and Ronnie over at Smart Patients and the online community that they're creating. And they're doing exactly what you're saying. That's the concept. And at my last email, they were actually looking at going live tonight. You guys have heard about them, or some of you have anyway, and sort of like a piloting the program and the intake form and how it was all going to work and bring information back. And now it's actually happening. So it's donating your data for exactly that purpose. So, we work together with them and a lot of the docs that we work with to come up with the information we were going to be bringing in. iColor, ironically, is actually one of them. So one of the little pieces of information we're capturing. But the idea is to share your information so that physicians and researchers can have access to this information for clinical trial purposes, for research down the road. So it is happening. They're doing a huge push in lung, also in melanoma to start with, and then obviously they'd like to.
And I could also see the Watson approach of the future being applied to this, where we can only think of what we are looking for, and it could easily be that when you apply algorithms, it will find patterns that we did not see. That we're going to need lots of data, but we'll need some creative thought that isn't necessarily limited to what we are, the heuristics that we have always had.
Well, and we have
smoking status,
yeah,
et cetera.
Exactly. And we at this point we won't even be looking at smoking status. We're going to be looking at genomics and other biomarkers from other cancers and other diseases and all of these things wrapped up in one body. Jill, stand up so people can see who you are.
Well, most of you remember Gilles because he came and spoke.
Yeah.
So I want to give one real example of what happens when you start to collect data about patients for a totally different kind of cancer called gastrointestinal stromal tumor. There is this amazing drug called Gleevec, which acts like a miracle drug on over 85% of the people that have this specific kind of cancer, except that it has been discovered that this 85% is only valid in Caucasians. In Asian people, less than 5% have their GIST due to the mutation which Gleevec acts upon. And therefore, Gleevec does not work on Asian people. And that mutation, this c-KIT mutation, has now been found in small population with over 40 different kinds of cancer. And Gleevec works for the 40 different types of cancer, but only on Caucasians.
Right. And, I also believe, collecting this data, there's one thing to collect it. That takes one process. But then to really get into it and collate it and figure out what this all means, we need to bring in mathematicians, we need to bring in MIT, we need to bring in technology, we need to take this outside of the medical world and bring in masters at doing these things. And all of a sudden, you'll see this bubbling of information, and information is power. It's key.
Even with all those specialists and all those experts, I still believe that the most important part is to bring patients together to give
Exactly,
data.
because patients are the solution to this whole thing. Without us, guys, and all you people online, without us, we are harboring all the information necessary to get this done. So there has to be a renewed or a new respect and value put on patients and what they bring to the table.
If I may, I'll give you another example.
Okay.
In 2003, there was a drug approved for people with multiple myeloma and breast cancer, biphosphonate called Zometa. And in the labeling done by the FDA, they never mentioned one side effect, which was found by an online community because there suddenly people started to report some really nasty side effects. Dentists were the first one to say, are you taking any drug? Because I find that your jaw, you have osteonecrosis of the jaw.
Interesting, yeah.
And many, an online survey done on 2 online communities, one for multiple myeloma, the other one for breast cancer, found in 3 days enough information so that an article was published very fast in the New England Journal of Medicine describing this unknown side effect.
Right. We have to step out of the old way of doing things.
And I think just to kind of piggyback on what you just said about patients holding, all the answers within your bodies, right? Within your tissue and your blood and whatever else is going on. This kind of comes back full circle to what Dr. West and what Gilles are talking about, and the information that you share with one another that then you can then take back to your physicians and share with them. All of these things have to happen. It has to be like this perfect storm of information with everybody respectfully working within these boundaries. And by respectfully, I mean people, whether it's your physicians, whether you're the patient angle, whether you're industry, the people creating the trials. I think if everyone really kind of stands up and I think we are. I think we are absolutely moving into that era, which is what brings us to this space that Dr. West was talking about, where it all kind of comes together, where we can learn. And one thing I did want to touch on, because although there are a lot of amazing communities out there, such as Grace, there's also what are the challenges with some of the places out there where people might be finding information that, how do they know whether or not it's good information? How is that any different from something, like the guy selling the snake oil? Like how, right?
No, it's a great issue, but I think that the principles apply whether it's online or live or 2013 or 1913. It's really, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And I would say it's really important to know your source. Ask for the evidence. On the Grace website, what was initially OncTalk, which was just before it became a nonprofit. The title page just said, here's what I know, here's what I don't know. You don't have to believe everything, but I'll tell you why I do what I do. And you can agree or not agree, but if you disagree, tell me why, and we'll talk about it. Because I don't think that one person has got the direct line from God on this. I mean, there's plenty of style in a lot of this, as I indicated with the panel discussions. I mean, this is not something where there's often only one way to think about it. And whether that's comforting or uncomfortable, I don't know. But anyway, what I would say is that a problem online is don't let your doctor tell you no, or you must, whatever. I think that's always concerning. This is something where I don't want to ever tell someone on the Grace site, or I don't think anybody online should be saying you should do X, Y, or Z. I meant to put the information out there and say, here's what we do, here's why we do it. Compare that to what you're seeing. And if you're asking your doctor, why are you not using Avastin for me? And they say, well, you've got some problems with protein in your coming out of your urine, or you've got bleeding issues, or some other side effect or complication, there might be a good reason. If your doctor says, what's Avastin? I think that's a problem, So it's not to say that you have to do things one way. I think it's a real problem to have you should do whatever. I would also caution anecdotal cases. They say the plural of anecdotes is not data. So the problem is that the plural of anecdotes is not data. So, you know, the idea that somebody once got a drug and did well is not the same thing as that thing made them do well. Even with Avastin and breast cancer, I don't know if your friend is doing well because of the Avastin or it's alligator repellent. I mean, in other words, they might have been doing just as well without it. We don't know. That's why we do the studies in a lot of people. And so I think that's one of the issues with the testimonials of, they told me at so-and-so institution I was going to be dead in 2 weeks, and here I am 3 years later feeling great. Well, sometimes there's morons who say dumb things like you're going to die in 2 weeks. And it was actually not lung cancer, but an infection. I mean, one of the things that I've heard is, you know, even a broken clock is right twice a day. I mean, sometimes that it's just coincidence. And you don't know what the other 999 people did who went to that institution who were told that they weren't going to do well. They didn't do well.
And what's good for the goose isn't always good for the gander.
Right. I mean, so anyway, that's my concern is that, and online too. I mean, online you're only going to hear from the people who you can hear from. The people who didn't do well with X or Y treatment are not online telling you how great they did. So that's why I would just be cautious. I'm not proselytizing that everyone has to print out Kaplan-Meier curves and 95% confidence intervals or hazard ratios. But just one thing about the GRACE site is it's pretty data heavy, but it's also partly so that patients will understand why doctors are thinking in the way they do. So I think it's important to try to speak the same language, and doctors should make it accessible. But it's also good if patients and caregivers, many become staggeringly sophisticated about the literature and stuff online, and it always helps when we can come together and speak a common language.
Go.
Hi, my name is Hope. I didn't get a chance to introduce myself. I came in a little bit late because of traffic. But my husband had adenocarcinoma, and when we found out about the cancer, I asked one of the nurses, okay, so what do you know about this clinic you're referring us to? What can you tell me? And she said, all I can tell you is stay off of the internet. Stay away from Google. It'll be nothing but trouble. And there's definitely, I heard that a lot from practitioners, but I've certainly learned since then that these online communities, there's so much valuable information. So what we can do as caregivers, as cancer patients, is change that advice from the nurses and the doctors who tell that new patient to stay away from the internet. Is it's one-on-one conversations. As much as we try to, you can advertise about these things, but I never would have known about Smart Patient. I never would have known about GRACE. I never would have known about a lot of things if I didn't come to these meetings and seek out this information. Right. And I do everything that I can with everybody in my life on my Facebook to tell people about Bonnie J. Addario, about Smart Patient. I hear of a friend who has cancer. I say, Smart Patient, here's the link, give me their email address. I do what I can to share that information, and it's important for all of us to do that whenever we can. But I also know that when you have cancer, or when your significant other or a family member has cancer, you've got a lot on your plate. And it's not always easy to do these things. So one thing that I wanted to say is, if anybody is not particularly internet savvy, and Smart Patient, maybe you've gone onto it, but you've had a little bit of trouble figuring it out, or you're not used to Facebook, so Smart Patient seems a little foreign, please reach out to me afterwards. Contact Danielle, or also contact other people in your life. Something that I found right now, it's not a problem for me to research things, but when my husband was first sick, I just didn't have the the mental energy to go onto these websites and read about these things. It was just too much. But I had a friend who was just waiting for the opportunity to find this out. And she read the entire MAGIC study for me. He had gastric cancer. She read the entire study and sent me a list of questions to ask his oncologist, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we doing that? There are people in your lives that may be able to help you in facilitating this communication, because like Bonnie was saying, patients are the solution. And the more we can share with each other and support each other in this process, the better off we'll all be. And I just wanted to offer my help to anybody here, anybody online. You can reach me through Danielle, but also reach out to your own communities to, if going online isn't your comfortable area or reading this data, there's probably someone in your life that's waiting for the opportunity to help this way.
And just remember, and this is an important point I want to reiterate that Jack said, you know, you hear somebody's on Tarceva and it sounds like the wonder drug, and in some cases it is. And why aren't you on Tarceva or crizotinib or Avastin or whatever? We're all unique and different. And what's good for your neighbor isn't good for you. Your neighbor's grass is green, yours is yellow, you're putting the same fertilizer on it and it's just not working. And it's not ever gonna work. Your grass is never gonna be green because you shouldn't even be trying to be a gardener. So the best thing to do is ask your doctor, you know, I've heard about this drug, Tarceva or whatever. Can you explain why that's not good for me? And go to the horse's mouth. That's why we like to bring the horses in, so they can make some common sense out of all of this. But you're all very unique. There's a formula for you personally, but it's not necessarily going to be the one that the person sitting next to you
Well, that's why I do think it makes sense to say, to come in saying, here's what I'm interested in, and not say, why this, why not this. Ideally, your doctor should be able to cogently explain why they've selected or recommended one approach over another, and if not, know that. And I think the main thing is not to say, hey, why am I not getting X or Y, parenthesis, you idiot, you know. So that's the main thing, and that's, I think, what docs are concerned about, losing authority, and that I don't think ego should really come into it, but I think that there's plenty of room to come together. I know that many of the docs who, there are many docs who come up and say that Grace and many of the other organizations here are doing great things, and they love having educated patients. I love having patients who don't just nod and say, whatever you say, doc, because I'd like to think that what I'm saying makes sense to them. I'd like to make a compelling argument that they are invested in, rather than just they're doing it because they don't care enough to object. Did you have a question or two?
So there's a couple of questions from online, and what I want to tell the people online is I'm going to ask Jack and get back to you with the answers to that, because we are running out of time with our live stream, and with the fact that I promised Jack I'd try to get him to the airport to get him to clinic. So I just I want to say a few thank yous. One, obviously a huge thank you to Dr. West for coming in and talking to us tonight. Yeah. You guys, I know we've talked about Grace before, and it's grace.org.
Cancergrace.org.
Cancergrace.org, sorry. If you want to go and talk to Jack a little bit more, you can find him there. As well as on the tweet chat. All these people are throwing up their 5 minutes on me, and it stresses me out. Obviously, right? Obviously, a huge thank you to the Safeway Foundation, to Genentech, to Penn TV, and to the office, without whom we wouldn't be able to provide this, not only for everybody in the room, but everybody online tonight, and the people that will sign on looking forward. Thank you, obviously, to everyone online for chiming in and seeing what we're doing. And I want to kind of throw out a real quick statistic that we're really excited about at what our video series through Ustream and online, people able to watch live, as well as people that go back and watch after the fact. In August alone, we reached over 200,000 people in 139 countries. So It's been amazing. Yeah. So thank you to all of you yet again in the room for allowing us to take what used to be your own sort of personal space and bring it out to the people around the world, because
Look how many other patients are listening to you here.
Yeah.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, it really is amazing. Don't forget about the San Francisco run. If you're sitting in this room, build your team. Get out there, contact Jen, September 29th. And Philadelphia, for anybody
Rhode
online
Island.
who might be watching in the Philly area. We are the weekend after the run, so it's October 7th. Yes, 7th, the weekend after. Call Jen, she'll tell
Apparently
you.
we don't know.
Yeah, no, we know. Sorry, it's my fault. It's my broken face.
Yeah,
It's making me forget.
Yeah. And brain.
Reminder about Thursday, Steve Harvey, 2 o'clock, and I want to tell you guys that I have something for you afterwards from Liz. Once we have to go off, I'll pass that out to everybody and send it to all my online people.
And for the new patients, our book over here on the piano.
I got all kinds of goodies for them. And a happy birthday to Sally. I don't know how many of you do or don't know that today is Sally's birthday, and she chose to spend it here with us. So we just want to say a big happy birthday to Sally.
We have two people now that need a really much better social life, Penelope and Sally.
So what I want to pass out to all of you guys is this. I know that Elizabeth has talked to all of us about the writing group that she's in, as Writing Through Cancer, and she took one of her writings and gave it to some people at BMS, because BMS had reached out to us looking for somebody that we thought could come and give a presentation on their disease in front of some of their coworkers and whatnot. So Liz came out, and one of the guys that worked at BMS was so inspired by her and her story, he actually put a cartoon to it. So it's amazing, and I printed out copies for everybody so you can see not only Elizabeth's great writing, but how great the artwork that comes with it.
Oh my goodness, look who has flowers.
So these are on the piano on the way out, and we obviously have the Navigating Lung Cancer books for any new patients or anybody who has yet to pick one up.
And that book's going to be on an iPhone app very shortly.
The book is going to be on the iPhone app very shortly, very, very, very shortly. But the app's going to be more than just the handbook. It's going to have, a button push link back to the video, or the edited down videos of these living rooms, the 20-minute segments, as well as a glossary of terms if really quickly you need to know what some big cancer word means, as well as a track
Or
your
some
cancer.
of the words Jack said tonight, I don't know. Like what?
As well as a tracking your cancer button, so you can keep track of everything you've got going on, and keep it all in one space. So it's going to be really, really cool, and we'll let you guys all know as soon as that comes out. So Steve Harvey, Thursday, 2 o'clock, New Zealand tomorrow. Everybody wish on it. And that's it. Thank you all very, very, very much.
All right.